I flew on New Pacific Airlines Boeing 757. New Pacific Airlines, formerly known as Northern Pacific Airways, is one of the more interesting American airline startups in recent years. First announced back in 2021, their initial business model was based around using Anchorage, Alaska as a hub for trans-Pacific flights and operating a fleet of Boeing 757s. Essentially, they wanted to emulate Icelandair, but across the Pacific, by connecting the US with destinations in Asia and offering stopovers in Alaska. However, with the closure of Russian airspace in 2022, the company now needed to obtain ETOPS certification for their 757s, which they could only apply for once they started actual scheduled flights. So, in July 2023, they finally launched passenger service from Ontario, California to Las Vegas, Nevada. Not quite the direction people expected the company to go. Later on that year, they also added flights from Ontario to Reno, Nevada, and Nashville, Tennessee. It was also around that time that they were forced to change their name from Northern Pacific to New Pacific, which I'll touch on a bit later. Now, these flights between Ontario and Reno were very cheap, and seemed like a unique way to cross off a flight on the 757-200. I've already flown on the longer 757-300 with Condor in Germany in 2022, but hadn't been able to fly on the shorter and more prolific 200 variants just yet. So, while I was in Southern California back in March with two good friends of mine, a quick afternoon trip up to Reno to fly on a very specific airplane seemed like the normal and well-adjusted thing to do. Now, having said that, most of this video has not aged well since New Pacific ended up stopping their scheduled flights less than a month after this was filmed. Still, passenger 757s are not so common where I'm from, and flying on one not operated by a major carrier like United or Delta was interesting enough. New Pacific's flights here in Ontario, and by the way, not the Ontario I'm used to referencing, operated out of Terminal 4 and had their check-in area here complete with a very nice looking sign. We were able to check in online without any issues, but obviously wanted a physical boarding pass as a keepsake. I also made sure to grab myself a couple of bag tags too. Now technically, while the airline may be called New Pacific, it's actually a sister company to Raven Alaska, an Alaskan regional airline, and operates under its air carrier certificate. As a result, New Pacific flights use Raven flight numbers as well as their call sign of Raven Flight. Ontario International Airport mainly serves the Inland Empire region of Southern California and is about 76 kilometers, or 47 miles, east of LAX. Terminal 4 here in Ontario is very clearly dominated by Southwest, and those black 757 tails sure stand out. Gate 402 wasn't too far of a walk, and fortunately had a beautiful view of our 757 for today, a 29-year-old 757-200 registered as November 628 November Papa. This one was delivered to US Air in 1995, which then became US Airways, and then moved over to American Airlines when the two carriers merged in 2013. It was retired from American and parked in March 2020, and was then taken up by Northern Pacific Airways in April 2022. Northern Pacific then became New Pacific due to a trademark dispute with BNSF Railway, which still held the trademark of one of its predecessors, the Northern Pacific Railroad. Rather than spend, no doubt, limited financial resources on fighting a lengthy legal battle, the airline opted to change the name to New Pacific instead. I do think Northern Pacific was arguably a better name, but being able to keep the same logo and branding with only minor changes was definitely the right move. Speaking of which, they really do have a nice livery, though it certainly helps that the 757 is just such a great looking airplane in general. New Pacific has 4 757s registered to them, and parked nearby was another one on a remote stand. Since stopping their scheduled flights at the end of March, they've pivoted to charter-only operations, and I actually saw this very 757 in Calgary flying in the Carolina Hurricanes a few weeks ago. Meanwhile, it was time for us to head to Reno, so let's go see what it's like flying on New Pacific Airlines.
I can have a pass.
My seat for this first leg was in the forward cabin of the 757, in the first row of economy class, seat 10F. This is an economy preferred seat that New Pacific sold for a few dollars extra, a bulkhead row just behind their first class seats, which has a decent amount of space. The real reason for sitting here though is this fantastic view of that Rolls-Royce RB211. These engines on the 757 not only sound incredible, but these ones look very sharp with that nicely polished leading edge. It's very clear that Northern/New Pacific put a lot of effort into the design of the interior, right down to the little details on each individual seat. I knew we'd have lots of time throughout this afternoon to get acquainted with this plane.
Flight 711 service to Reno. Our flight time today is 1 hour.
On behalf of Pacific Airlines and our crew, we are happy that you chose to fly with us. At this time, if you could please direct your attention to the flight attendants and follow along with emergency.
We soon pushed back right on time, so please enjoy this wonderful sounding takeoff from Ontario, California, off of runway 26 right.
Be aware that your nearest exit remaining signs whenever they are illuminated, as well as all crew member instructions, commands, and posted placards concerning flight safety requirements. In accordance with federal regulations, this is a non-smoking flight.
Well, the sound of those RB211s never gets old. Obviously, this 1 hour flight from Ontario to Reno is not exactly a challenge for the 757. It takes us almost directly north, right along the Sierra Nevada mountains. In the bulkhead row on their 757, New Pacific had the usual tray tables in the armrest, which don't go up very high, but can slide back and forth. On the wall in front were some literature pockets, and in there was a piece of paper with instructions for connecting to the free onboard Wi-Fi, also still with the airline's old name on it. There was also a safety card in there too, again, still with the Northern Pacific name. Pretty quickly, the cabin crew started the in-flight service, handing out bags of chips, as well as a selection of complimentary beverages. As I was expecting, the mountain views on our way north were indeed spectacular, and I was pretty much glued to the window for the rest of the flight. I did, however, try their free onboard Wi-Fi, and although it doesn't connect with Safari for some reason, once it was connected, it actually worked surprisingly well. Obviously, an hour is not quite enough time to get a proper feel for a newer airline, but with a good seat, free Wi-Fi, excellent views outside, and snacks, I was certainly enjoying this. Ultimately though, I overheard that there were only 68 people on the flight, which for a 180-seater 757 is not great. Although New Pacific has a really nice product, financially it's pretty obvious to me why they switched to charters only. I'll talk about that a little more on the flight back. Just over halfway through the flight crew told us that we could expect the arrival into Reno to be a bit bumpy, and so the cabin was secured early. With some more great views on the descent, here's our arrival into a snowy Reno Tahoe International Airport, landing on runway 34 left.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of New Pacific Airlines, we would like to welcome you to Reno. For your safety and for the safety of passengers.
After landing here in Reno, we mentioned to the crew that we were here just to fly with New Pacific and the 757, and asked if we could go visit up front. Fortunately, they were more than happy to have us stick around for a bit longer. Our flight crew today was fantastic, and had tons of great stories about flying the 757. We also got to sit up there too for a bit, which was just such a treat. After that, we still had about an hour before boarding the flight back to Ontario, and went to take a look around the terminal. Before leaving the gate though, we asked for printed boarding passes for the next flight, and they had even more Raven branding than the first ones did. The very first thing you notice in the terminal here is the sheer abundance of slot machines. When in Nevada, I suppose. The scenery around us was gorgeous though. I didn't realize just how pretty this part of the state was in the winter. The airport itself seems pretty average, although they are apparently working on a major renovation project to spruce things up. We walked a bit further and grabbed a quick bite to eat in the central area between the concourses, which also had a nice view outside. On the way back, we came across this ad for New Pacific. Again, I think they have a great brand identity, but it's a shame these domestic routes didn't quite work out economically. Then again, with those prices they were offering, it's also not terribly surprising. Back at the gate, there wasn't much else to do but wait until they were ready for us to head back on board. In the meantime though, we had a great view of our 757 right in front of us.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For New Pacific Flight 775 with service to Ontario.
Eventually, it was down the jetway and back onto the 757.
Again.
For this next flight, I picked a seat further back behind the wing in row 28. Back here, the legroom was not nearly as good as up front, but this row still had the ideal aft wing view. As much as I love the sound of RB211s, I haven't sat behind the wing on a 757 before, so this worked out nicely. I will point out, these seats are quite heavily padded, which doesn't help the legroom situation, but still makes them quite comfortable.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you aboard Flight 775 with service to Ontario. Our flight time today will be approximately 1 hour.
We stayed at the gate for about 20 minutes past our scheduled departure time, but eventually started pushing back. Less than 2 hours after landing here, please enjoy this dual view of our departure from Reno. Climbed out of Reno into some beautiful sunset lighting, so before it gets too dark, let's take a look at some of the differences in a normal economy seat. The one thing that's apparent right away is that the backs of these seats definitely need a wipe down. Not sure if it's just the angle the light is hitting the leather at, but yeah. Moving on from that, these all-black tray tables are pretty sturdy and also slide too. The seat back pocket contents are the same, but one thing I didn't realize in the bulkhead row is that there's built-in power at each seat. Both USB-A and USB-C charging were available, even if these also didn't look super clean. Those comfortable-looking headrests were also adjustable, but they didn't go very high. In the meantime, the snowy landscape below, plus the sunset lighting, was just gorgeous. It was around then that the in-flight service began, with the same bag of chips and choice of drinks. I went for some cranberry juice, which came in this surprisingly high-quality cup. At the time, New Pacific Airlines had 181 seats on their 757s in a two-class configuration. Up front were 16 seats in first class, with 4 rows in a 2-2 layout. Interestingly, while checking in online, they offered me an upgrade to their first class for just $9 US. I had a pretty good seat booked already for both flights though, so didn't take them up on it. Behind first class was an interesting mini economy section before the second set of doors where I sat on that first flight. Here, there were 3 rows of seats on the right, and a single row on the left between a lavatory and the bulkhead. Those seats with the white horizontal stripe are all economy preferred and have some extra legroom with 36 of those seats in total. The rest of the cabin has 129 standard economy seats. All of those seats, by the way, were apparently the same ones that American had in this plane, but have been reupholstered very nicely. There are 4 lavatories on the 757, which were nice and clean, but are otherwise pretty typical. As you can tell, this flight back south was also not super full either. With their pivot to charter operations, the 757s have apparently been reconfigured with an all-business class configuration, so most of this is already out of date. Whether or not New Pacific will ever return to a scheduled operation of some sort, well, we'll have to see. When it came to these short-lived scheduled flights, their Ontario to Vegas service ended in January, and the flights to Reno and Nashville were only twice a week. Right now, though, they actually seem pretty busy flying NHL charters, arguably even busier than they were at this point in the year. There's definitely some money to be made there, especially when they have a very capable airplane like the 757 at their disposal. However, it seems there's also been some change in upper management recently, as their original CEO, who had been leading them and Raven since 2020, abruptly left the company in July. The other thing is, right around the time that this flight took place, Raven Alaska laid off almost a third of their workforce. It makes you wonder how much focus was on that part of the operation versus this big dream with the 757s. I sincerely hope things work out for New Pacific though. I had a great time flying with them today, and especially with the fantastic crew we had on board. Obviously, flying a more interesting airplane in the form of the 757 was a bonus, but I do think they had a really solid onboard offering, and the idea for the Asia flights connecting in Anchorage had some real promise. So, I wish everyone at New Pacific and Raven the best of luck, and I do hope to see them someday flying across the Northern Pacific.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of New Pacific Airlines, we would like to welcome you to Ontario, California. For your continued safety.
Thanks so much for watching this little 757 joyride with New Pacific Airlines, and I will see you next time.